you feel as though consciousness has and will one day have explanations which can be reduced to the physical. And so if we were to create an artificial intelligence which did have the desire or the will to survive, is that when things become dangerous?
I think that no one should really be actively trying to create a conscious AI. It's like, why would you do that apart from the desire to play God? The difference between conscious systems and non-conscious systems goes down to the level of the fact that we're made of cells that regenerate their own components, that transfer energy into matter and back again. We project consciousness into things that seem human-like in ways which might actually not matter at all. I feel that artificial consciousness, real artificial consciousness, if that's not an oxymoron, might require real artificial life. It's very tempting to think of the brain as a computer. People have been doing it for ages. And it's a powerful metaphor. It's a powerful map with which to explore some of the things that brains do. But we've always used a technological metaphor to understand the brain. And every time we have a metaphor, if we really think that is the thing, then we stop looking for what else might be there. And I think we need to start looking for what else might be there that marks a difference between brains and even the most powerful computers.
Hello everybody, and hello Anil.
Hello, Johnny.
So we're here to talk about consciousness today, and we're going to divide the talk into 3 acts, really. The first act, we're going to talk about the current state of consciousness science and what we know at the moment about consciousness. The second act will look at a more speculative view of what we can know about consciousness in the future and, of course, AI. And then the third act will open for questions from the audience, from you guys. So think of some good questions, and at the end, we'll take some hands to ask for Anil. So I thought that if we're going to talk about it for an hour, we should probably define our terms first and ask you what consciousness is, because presumably everybody in this room has consciousness, or is conscious right now, we hope. So how do we define it from a scientific point of view?
It is a good place to start, but it's also a dangerous place to start, because I think we can get caught up in definition a bit too much. I think it's important to define it, at least to the extent we're not talking about different things without realizing it. I mean, consciousness on the one hand, I think it's still one of these great mysteries. We have experiences of the world, blah, blah, blah. How does it happen? But it's also the most familiar. We all know what consciousness is, as you said, Johnny. It's what goes away when you go into a dreamless sleep, or even more profoundly under general anesthesia. And it's what comes back on the other side. It's hard to define without it being a little bit circular. It's like any kind of experience of the world. The redness of red, the paininess of pain. And I always like to use the definition from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who 51 years ago now put it like this. He said that for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism, that it feels like something to be a bat, as he put it in his paper, whereas it doesn't feel like anything to be a table or a glass of water, by almost any. Very few people would claim that. And when you're out under general anesthesia, it doesn't feel like anything to be you then either. So I think that's a good definition, because it's very general. It doesn't really make any presuppositions about what it is like to be you, just that there's something it is like to be a conscious thing.
So is it fair to say that we can talk about a human species consciousness, or would we have to look at every individual human consciousness in this room?
Oh, in this room, I was going to say every human would take a long time.
In the world.
Every human in this room. It's likely that we overestimate the similarity of conscious experiences even within a species. So Nagel in his paper talked about a bat. I mean, he was making a larger point about whether consciousness, this fact that some things experience and other things don't, whether that was addressable by science at all. But he kind of became more known for the idea that bats, assuming they are conscious, are going to have a very different kind of conscious experience. They have echolocation, so their experienced world we humans can maybe approximate, but we can never really experience what it's like to be a bat without being a bat. And I think the same thing applies in a smaller way within a species too. It's easy to assume that other people experience things in the same way we do because our conscious experience has the character that it, especially when it's experiences of the world rather than thoughts, it seems as though it's just there, right? It just seems like you're there, the wall is behind you, that doesn't depend on my brain, you're just there. But that's probably not what's going on. Everybody is creating their own unique world. Now, they won't be completely different, I think. Human experience is likely to be have a lot of commonalities, but there are going to be interesting differences as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so in your book, Being You, you describe yourself as a physicalist, which is where, and correct me if I'm wrong, you feel as though consciousness has and will one day have explanations which can be reduced to the physical. So we can explain consciousness in physical terms. And I thought if we could explore a little bit about what's going on in the brain when we're talking about consciousness. But before we do that, I was wondering if you could give us a quick primer about the ways which we can currently measure what is going on in the brain, the fMRI, and EEG and PCI you talk about in the book. If you could quickly talk us through
lots of things. They all tend to be compressed into acronyms for some reason. But firstly, though, you have all these isms in the philosophy surrounding consciousness research, and I will probably get back to that a bit later, maybe. But I always think they should be worn a little bit lightly. So I sort of describe myself as a pragmatic physicalist. Like, I don't believe in it as an ideology, as something that I know to be true and everything depends on it being true. I just think holding that attitude can deliver the most progress in understanding in practice, even if ultimately it turns out not to be the case, if somehow we were able to discern that. So I think it's a pragmatic perspective rather than a fundamentally held belief about how things are. Because of course, you say reduced to the physical. I mean, the physical is pretty mysterious. You know, it's not just like neurons or, I mean, who knows what matter is really? Matter is pretty mysterious and implacable when you get close to it. So being a physicalist is not to sort of be too reductive and say, oh yeah, it's just neurons exchanging signals. It could be many other things. Brain imaging. So, I mean, for me, this is like already a consequence of thinking, at least from the perspective of consciousness being a property of a physical system. We just have a ton of evidence that conscious experiences in human beings are intimately related to the human brain. And so it makes sense to start by trying to track the footprints of consciousness in the brain, look at brain activity and see how it varies as consciousness changes in human beings. And it's very, for me, it's been transformational. It's incredibly exciting that we can do this. You think about some of the other grand mysteries in science, like what happened at the beginning of time, what's the world really made of? You have challenges of looking far away and long ago, or looking at the very small, and these require massive instrumentation. It's really hard. Human brains are pretty accessible. You know, they're human size. There are lots of them to study, and they're kind of that's a great advantage. So, and the fact that we have these brain imaging methods now, since about the 1990s, they've been widespread. Historically, that's what gave consciousness research, I think, its modern momentum. But there's still a problem, because the challenge with imaging the human brain is not that it's far away or long ago or tiny, but that it's complex. So we have about 86 billion neurons. Each of those is a very complex little biological machine wired up in very intricate ways. And we don't have a sort of James Webb telescope for complexity. We can look at the brain in reasonably high spatial detail, but then we lose time. We can look at it in high time detail, but then we lose space. And in neither case can we look at all 86 billion neurons at once. So we're always trading off things in different ways. So when most people encounter brain imaging, they're usually seeing these fMRI scans. This is functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's wonderful technology. You see these colored blobs and pictures of the brain. It's not actually measuring brain activity. It's measuring something about the metabolic consequence of brain activity. Neurons fire, they consume energy, blood oxygen levels change, magnetic properties change. That's what it's measuring. It's very indirect, and it's over a time scale of seconds, whereas neurons are on the time scale of milliseconds. That's one technique. In my lab, we use a lot of EEG, electroencephalography. It's probably the oldest. Neurons generate little electromagnetic fields when they do stuff, and we can measure the collective impact of those electromagnetic changes. And that's very fast. We do this to have sensors over the brain. You don't need so much fancy kit. But it's fairly low resolution. It's a bit like dangling a microphone above the centre of Oxford and trying to figure out what individual people are saying to each other. You can't discern the fine-grained chatter between individual people. And maybe that's where the detail is. And so then you have the method of sticking wires directly into people's brains, which I do not do in my lab. You have to have good clinical reasons to do that. Then you know exactly where the neurons are and you know exactly what they're doing, but you can only typically measure a few of them at a time. This is growing. People can measure maybe hundreds, perhaps thousands now, but that's a tiny, tiny fraction of the billions that you have. So those are the sorts of techniques that we have to use.
So if we have these trade-offs all of the time when we're measuring consciousness, and even then you say yourself that it's slightly inadequate at the moment. Do you think the problem of measuring consciousness is one of technology, that we haven't got the right scanning equipment available to us? Or is it one of science, that we will require a completely different scientific paradigm to accommodate consciousness?
You're giving me two options, neither of which are very appealing. Okay. I mean, it's like, I think it's both of those and more, but slightly different. So the problem of measuring the brain is kind of a technological problem that's going to depend on scientific innovations, like developing new ways to measure signals, measure really what's happening in the physiology. There are some new ideas, but we're reasonably stuck with what we have. One new idea, for instance, which you can't do in humans, which is really changing things, is called optogenetics. So this is where you modify the genomes of animals, and such that neurons actually they give out light, or they reflect light in different ways. So you can find out a lot that way, but you can't do this in human beings because you've got to genetically modify them. Anyway, that's one problem. That's a scientific, technological problem. That's not measuring consciousness. That's measuring the brain. So then you have to ask, how do you connect changes in consciousness to the changes that you see in the brain? And you can do this like in a very exploratory way, just put somebody out under anesthesia, see what happens, or watch what happens when they go to sleep, or many other experimental paradigms. But you'll see a lot of things change in the brain. How do you know which of those things are specifically to do with consciousness? So then you have to have theories that try and bridge the two. And I think that's kind of where we are now. We have a bunch of theories that make different predictions about what happens in the brain as consciousness changes. But you're right that it's very hard to tell them apart. And part of the problem is that we lack the precision in our measurements, but also the precision in our theories. They don't make that precise predictions just at the moment.
So hypothetically, do you think there could be a technology which can measure Thomas Nagel's degree of first personhood, qualia? Or are you saying that we will always deal in correlations, that we'll always have to say, this is the physical thing happening, and therefore we have to correlate it to some kind of consciousness as a kind of inference? Or do you think we will have a technology which can identify first personhood?
I think we start with correlations. Right? When we're trying to understand a phenomenon empirically that is resistive to our understanding, a good way to start is just by looking for correlations. What goes with what? But that's just the starting point. And you want to go from correlation towards explanation, so that you have a sense of why X goes with Y. I mean, you see there's like all these crazy examples of the price of cheese in Wisconsin has correlated over time with a divorce rate in France, right? That means nothing, I think. I don't know, maybe it does. But it probably means nothing. It's just a correlation. There's no explanatory insight gained. And if you say, oh, look, we see activity in whatever area change when you fall asleep, and just leave it at that, that also doesn't really give you much explanatory insight. So you need to to get to the stage of like, this process happening in the brain, that tells me something about the conscious experience that's going on, or the fact that there is one versus there not being one. And that's partly a technological challenge. I think the more we can do with improving these methods, the better. But I don't think it would be helpful, but there's an awful lot we can do without that. Part of the challenge is more of a mathematical one. We lack the tools to deal with the complexity of the data that we have, even with the relatively low resolution imaging methods that already exist. And as we get more towards explanation, I think we are making progress in that way. Then will we get as far as answering this hard problem, I think, that was mentioned, that why is consciousness there at all? What's it got to do with the physical world? Maybe we will, maybe we won't, but we'll certainly get further towards that as a sort of an endpoint, as a goal.
Great, thank you. So if we're talking about correlations and neural consciousness correlation, you talk about NCCs in the book, talk about acronyms. With the current state of consciousness science, neuroscience at the moment, if we were to give everybody in this room here an EEG or some kind of brain scanner, with what degree of certainty could you infer what is going on in people's minds? Because I know in the book you talk about consciousness level, consciousness content, and consciousness selfhood. With what degree of certainty could you predict what's going on in seat J4 right now?
Who's singing J4? I don't know. So, yeah, I think you're right. I like to think of these three different aspects to consciousness: level, how conscious you are; content, what you're conscious of; and self, the experience of being who you are, the experience of being the subject of experience, which is really a subset of content. It's a subset of your overall conscious experience, but I think it's worth its own category because it's rather special. If everyone was wearing EEG and the data was good, it's kind of not too difficult to predict whether you're conscious or not. That can be done. Human beings in conscious states have, their brain activity is relatively predictable in some ways. You have lots of sort of fast oscillations going on in various frequency bands, and there are other more sophisticated ways of measuring this. And when you fall asleep, you see very distinct patterns when you fall asleep and you're not dreaming. Same under anesthesia. So I think that would be fine for most people. But even then, it's like there are weird edge cases. There are people who have brain injuries, for instance, and then it might be harder. If someone is in something called the vegetative state or the wakeful unawareness state, they might look awake, but they also look like there's nobody at home. And then it becomes a much more tricky problem to tell whether there's any consciousness going on inside. When it comes to predicting what you're conscious of, it's much, much harder. But there is this growing research field of brain reading now. I mean, people used to call it mind reading, but now there's brain reading. And brain reading is precisely this. Brain reading is taking somebody's brain signals, measuring them somehow, and then trying to predict what they are thinking, what they are experiencing. This is now it's one of those things that's moving from science fiction into science reality. And there are some already really, to me, impressive examples of this that are usually used in clinical cases. So people, for instance, who are paralyzed, you can now begin to read out their movement intentions, so you can help them control robots, or maybe even guide their own arms by stimulating muscles, decode what they want to say so they can regain the ability to communicate in some cases. So there's a strong impetus for this to be done. But there's the issue of this is actually a very dangerous technology in many ways. We don't have we think we have freedom of speech, which is arguable in some cases, but very few places have freedom of thought. And once you have brain imaging things that are predicting what you're thinking, then you've lost that last bastion of privacy, because once you get inside the skull, there's nowhere else left. And also these algorithms that do these predictions are not perfect. So your brain reading might be inaccurate, and also you might be forced to think in a particular way for the thing to work. But technology is moving in this direction. This whole field of brain-computer interfaces is really all about this. And I actually, it's very exciting, but it's, to me, also ethically really rather worrying. But right as we stand now, I don't think we'd be able to predict with great certainty what you were all thinking right here and right now. But I think that might change. I'm advising a couple of companies that are trying to do brain reading with consumer EEG, and they're getting quite far. It's quite astonishing.
So you're right, in your book, you talk about lots of isms around consciousness and about philosophy generally, really, to be honest. But you identify as a physicalist.
Pragmatic physicalist.
A pragmatic physicalist,
yes.
But agnostic about functionalism. Is that right?
Yeah, I quite like it. Yeah, quite like it.
So you're leaning more towards functionalism.
I think you've got to be flexible. Like, yeah, I'd be disappointed if I held exactly the same view.
We probably explain functionalism first, actually.
Yeah. So, it's kind of a so physicalism is the position that consciousness is a property of the physical world, of material stuff generally. It's kind of one of the bedrock assumptions of science as it's been done for the last 100 years, that things are properties of physical stuff, whether it's electrons or some higher level of description. That's physicalism. It's really, originally might have been opposed to something like dualism, which is that, yes, you've got physical stuff, neurons and whatever neurons are made of, but then the world of the mind, the world of the mental is completely different. And René Descartes was sort of famous for articulating this position. And then right on the other side, you've got idealism, which is the view that actually the physical world doesn't really exist. The only thing that really exists is mental stuff, mind stuff. And what seems to be physical is just a manifestation of the mental. Within physicalism then, within this idea that consciousness is somehow a property of the physical world, one of the most popular flavors of that is functionalism. And that's saying that consciousness is a property of the physical world, it's a property of the brain, perhaps in its body, and the body's in the world. And what matters for consciousness to be a property of the brain is the functional organization of the brain. Not intrinsically what it is, but what it does in some sense. How it's organized, and this can be on the inside too, how it's wired up, what its causal architecture is. That's all part of functionalism. And that's probably the prevailing idea among most people working in consciousness science and from a neuroscience perspective. So it's pretty liberal. I mean, it's not like it needs to be distinguished from much more specific claims, which we'll get onto, like the brain is a computer and consciousness is this algorithm. I mean, that's a very specific kind of functionalism.
Yeah, you're right. We'll come back to that, I guess, when we talk about AI a bit later on. But I mean, before that, I want to another ism, and that's an ism which is very popular in philosophy at the moment, and some people in this room even are panpsychists, panpsychism. So I wonder if you could just quickly tell us what panpsychism is and why you are possibly less excited about it than some people.
Well, how many people are panpsychists? Let's see. I know. Well, half a hand. I knew there's going to be not many. Well, maybe we could explain. Maybe more people will become it after I've tried to pour cold water on it, and then. The question is, how many people are panpsychists? All right. So we'll start with that. We'll start with that. So we've had the idea that consciousness is part of the physical world, or it's a property of physical stuff, or that it's everything that exists is mind. Then panpsychism is the idea that, okay, there is a physical world, but consciousness is also fundamental. It's a fundamental property of the world that we inhabit, a fundamental property of the universe. A little of the same status as something like mass or electrical charge. That's it. That's where things bottom out. Like most things you can say, the table is the way it is because it's made of wood and it has legs, and you can keep going down. And eventually you get to electrons or quarks or whatever you want to do. Somewhere you bottom out. Panpsychism is the idea that you bottom out at consciousness as well. That it's there from the beginning. There's no point asking how it's generated by something else, or arises or emerges from something else. It's just there from the very beginning. So that's, now that I've explained what panpsychism is, I think hopefully that's reasonably not inaccurate. How many people feel like attracted by that idea? Okay, a few more now. Right, it's still a minority. You're right though. It's having its kind of day in the sun, I think. And yeah, I'm not remotely persuaded by it. And there are a few reasons for it. Firstly, it might be right. All of these positions we've been talking about, none of them can actually be tested. They're all kind of can't decide whether it's actually a property of physics or or the world is all mental. They're all ways of thinking about things. But panpsychism strikes me as not a very useful or productive way to think about things, even if it ultimately might be right. And I think there's like some very quick reasons for this. One is that it mainly seems motivated by a suspicion that a physicalist explanation isn't enough. People think, well, you'll never be able to explain consciousness in terms of neurons or brains or carbons or computation or whatever it might be. You'll never be able to do that. You'll always be missing the point somewhere. You'll always be explaining some other thing that's not really consciousness. And so if you're always missing the point and you're always going to miss the point, then it has to be something else. And one of the other ways to think about it is, well, if it's just there from the beginning, then great. You don't have to explain how it's produced by or is identical to something else. But I think that really underestimates how far we can get with materialism. Just because something might seem a bit mysterious now doesn't mean it will always therefore seem mysterious at all. So I'm suspicious of the motivation. And then I don't think it gets, even if you did buy into it, I don't think it gets you anywhere. So panpsychism is often caricatured a little bit as saying that things like tables or spoons are conscious, like everything is conscious. It's not saying that. It's saying that it's fundamental. Like an electron might have a little bit of consciousness, but it's going to be nothing like the consciousness of you or me or a bat or a bee. If there's nothing really that you can grab onto there, then it doesn't help you explain anything. The fact that the consciousness of an electron is nothing like the consciousness of me, well, therefore, what explanatory line, how does it tell me anything about what it's like to drink a glass of water or fall asleep or dream? It just doesn't. And then the second worst thing is that not only is it not testable, but it doesn't lead to testable predictions. If you think in this sort of panpsychist way, another way it's often motivated is that science tends to tell us what things do, but not what they are. And maybe we're interested in what things are. And of course we are. But what things are is kind of what they do at another level. Some panpsychist arguments say that consciousness is the intrinsic nature of everything. It's what things are that's completely separable from what they do at the most fundamental level. So even if you have other forces in physics, like gravity or the strong nuclear force, they're still about what things do. But consciousness may be actually what things are. But if that's the case, then you're admitting that it can never make a difference to anything. If it's fundamentally about what things are, if it's nothing to do with what things do or their disposition to do things, it can never make a difference to anything. So that's fairly useless.
So are you against emergence as a property?
Absolutely
So the
not.
idea that emergence is the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, that consciousness is something which emerges from these physical neural correlates we talked about earlier, but it itself is not reducible to the parts that make it up.
I like the way of thinking that emergence is all about. And again, it's a very slippery concept that's often used quite lazily. Like you have something, it's often used as a substitute for an actual explanation. Like you have a load of neurons in our brain and you say, oh yeah, consciousness emerges from the collective activity of our billions of neurons. Well, of course, if you just say that, you're not really saying anything at all. Having said that, I think it's a starting point from which you can develop useful explanations. Emergence is a sensible way of thinking about systems. I think often about in Brighton, where I live, in the winter, in the evenings around sunset, these murmurations of starlings start flocking, and then they settle to roost on the ruins of the old West Pier. It's beautiful. And when they start to flock, the flock seems to have a kind of autonomy, a mind of its own, an existence of its own. It seems to be more than the sum of its parts. Yet, of course, we know they're just birds flying around. There's nothing spooky or mysterious going on there. They're just birds flying around. But sometimes when they do this, they flock, and sometimes they don't. And we can figure out how we might measure that. And that's part of the work we do in my lab. We try and develop mathematical ways of measuring the flockiness of starlings. And the thing is, if you can do that with starlings, then you can generalize and you can say, okay, maybe neurons flock, but not in three-dimensional space, but in some bigger, high-dimensional space of however many neurons. Does that explain consciousness? No, I don't think it does. But it can give us something that's a little bit more than a brute correlation. Because when we do have a conscious experience, one of the things about it is it's unified. We have a single experience at a time, and it's composed of many different parts. And in our brain, we have many different parts whose activity seems to be more coordinated in particular ways when we're conscious. So maybe the mathematics of emergence give us a handle on how the brain is related to consciousness, which is a very different perspective from just saying, you have neurons and then consciousness sort of emerges from their activity, like, I don't know, whatever, Aladdin rubbing his lamp, and what comes out of, I've forgotten now.
Big genie.
Genie comes out of the lamp, yeah. So that's the wrong way to think of it. I think there are some much more productive ways to think about it, which are also perfectly compatible with the idea that reductionism holds. Like the birds again, the flock of birds. Nothing new physically comes into the world, right? But the flock is kind of real. The flock being there changes how the birds behave. This table too is in some sense emergent from the things that make it up. But the table is also real, but nothing spooky or magical is happening just because there's a table there, rather than a whole bunch of electrons.
We should talk about AI.
Oh, okay.
And we mentioned earlier how you're a functionalist and how you feel as though consciousness can be explained by the function of the physical composition.
Well, I think that's like a gambit, right? I think that's the strategy. I don't know if it's true.
Somewhat better than agnostic now, you think, maybe. And so we're talking about AI. So when you're writing your Being You, I was reading it a couple of days ago, you were actually writing at the time of ChatGPT-3. So this was 4 years ago. I actually didn't realize how recent, how far away that was. Before we talk about AI, could you give us a quick primer about how existing large language models are made and artificial intelligence is made? Because we often talk about neural networks and neural symbiotic or symbolic networks and how they are different, if they are different, to the human neural networks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's too much to say about that, which we won't. But I think perhaps the thing to draw out of that is that firstly, these things are amazing. You're right. When I remember, I look back at that chapter now. I wrote about my last chapter in the book was about AI, and it was written just when language models were breaking through into the public sphere, and they have been transformational. And to me, it's amazing how quickly we get used to them. It's like they exist now. We're used to them. How we adapt so quickly? It's really, really strange. And there are many technical details of how they do what they do. But I think the thing to dwell on here is in all the AI systems that are populating the world today, whether they're language models or AlphaFold, which predicts protein structures and things like that, they're based, at least in part, if not almost in whole, on artificial neural networks. And these are an abstraction. They're an abstraction of brains in general. And basically they're little units that are wired together. I mean, in an actual computer, they're just simulations of these little units. They aren't actually little units. They're wired together, they exchange signals, so they look a little bit like a brain. Neurons wired up together and so on. And signals flow, and you can apply different training algorithms and enormous amounts of data, and wonderful things happen, like language models. The problem is, or at least the problem when it comes to thinking about whether AI built this way will ever have all the properties that human brains have, is that human brains are much more than that. So these artificial neural networks are a pale abstraction of the real biological complexity of what's inside each of our skulls. Does that matter? No. Does it matter that there's more going on? It might not, but it really might matter that there is more going on. I think actually when we see some of the limits of what AI can do, they're not necessarily things that are going to be solved just by increasing the amount of computer power or the amount of data. It might be because we've actually accidentally reified a metaphor. We've confused the map with a territory. It's very tempting to think of the brain as a computer. People have been doing it for ages. And it's a powerful metaphor. It's a powerful map with which to explore some of the things that brains do. But we've always used a technological metaphor to understand the brain. And it's always been limited. And I don't think there's a reason why this is different. It's just a metaphor that's now reaching the end of its utility. And every time we have a metaphor, if we really think that is the thing, then we stop looking for what else might be there. And I think we need to start looking for what else might be there that marks a difference between brains and even the most powerful computers.
You mentioned Nagel at the start, and of course Nagel talks about bats, and in your book as well, you're quite happy to say that certain animals potentially could have consciousness, a degree of consciousness, even if it's not the same, as you mentioned earlier, as human consciousness. So why can we not ascribe that also to artificial intelligence? Or does artificial intelligence lack a necessary component that all of the animals that you're quite happy to say are conscious do have? And what is that necessary component?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is like literally the billion-dollar question in some ways, isn't it, given the amount of money that's flowing around in AI these days. I had my PhD in AI, but seems to be about 20 years too early for it to be monetarily useful. So the contrast between non-human animals, like, I don't know, a hamster or a fish and an AI system, I think is really, really instructive. I think we can be a lot more confident about consciousness being a property of many non-human animals. There are good questions to ask about whether all non-human animals have some kind of consciousness, or whether it does kind of grey out into nothingness somewhere. For me, I start to feel uncomfortable around insects. I don't really know what to say about insects. But we're all made of the same stuff. Does that matter? We'll get to that. We're all made of the same stuff. And we all, in some sense, have similar problems to solve, to keep a body alive, to navigate an environment, and to integrate lots of different kinds of information together. We can never be certain about anything. I don't even know whether you are actually conscious, though my prayer is fairly high that you are. But we always have to infer. Some philosophers will tell you that you don't even know if you're conscious, which is, who knows. And the further we get from the benchmark human case, then the more unsafe our inferences are. And that's part of the work that needs to be done now, is we have to generalize very slowly and carefully into the zone of uncertainty and try and push that further and further out as we understand more about what is really underpinning consciousness in us and what's not just contingent on the fact that we're humans. Like, for instance, if you think consciousness is associated with something really distinctively human, like sophisticated language. Other species have language too, but the ability to write poems or something like that, then you're not going to attribute it to many other species at all. But that's a view that's rooted in our unfortunate human tendency to put humans at the center of everything, rather than being an insight into what's actually going on in the world. And I think that's also what misleads us when it comes to AI. We project consciousness into things that seem human-like in ways which might actually not matter at all. Now, up until a few years ago, if anything spoke to you with the fluency of ChatGPT, you'd be very justified in saying that was conscious. If someone with brain injury suddenly started conversing with you in depth, you can be pretty sure they'd regained consciousness. But now we have an example of a system where that inference might not be safe because there are just other ways of doing it, it turns out. Not perfect. They're not, anyone who's chatted for long enough, they're not perfect, but they're pretty good. I think we project these psychological biases that we all have where we see the world through the lens of being human. And so we overestimate the plausibility of machine consciousness. Nobody thinks that AlphaFold, which is this AI system that folds proteins, is conscious because it doesn't speak to us, but it's basically doing the same kind of thing under the hood. And that's telling, I think. It tells us that our tendency to attribute consciousness to AI is largely a property of what we think rather than what's there. Then there are deeper questions about whether consciousness could ever be a property of computation. And here I think there's a lot of people disagree with each other and with me about this, but I think that brains do a lot more than algorithms, and that I think the things that they do that are not algorithms actually do matter for consciousness. So I think AI systems might persuasively appear to be conscious, and that's problematic in its own ways. But I think the chances of AI actually being conscious with the current systems that we have, even if you just let them run and see where we are, like ChatGPT 10 or something like that, I don't think we'll get any closer at all. We might get stuff that's much more persuasive that it is, but I don't think we'll get stuff that actually moves the needle on being conscious.
So what would it take for you to ascribe consciousness to an AI? Or do you think even the word artificial consciousness is impossible? Do you think it has to be embodied? Do you think it has to be organic and natural?
I mean, I don't know for sure. I'm always wary of overconfidence in both directions here. I think that's part of the problem. I think people who are very, very confident that conscious AI is coming or it's already here are, I think they're unjustified in that level of confidence. I also think people who say it's for sure impossible are also overconfident in completely ruling it out. My bias is that it's very unlikely, and the reason I think it's unlikely is because the kind of explanation of consciousness that's starting to make sense to me is that it's a property of living systems. It's closely tied to the fact that we are creatures with metabolism, with physiology, with all this other stuff that's not computational going on that actually gives us insight into why consciousness is the way it is, why it happens at all. And one thing that sort of leaps out when you look at the brain for what it is and not look at it through the lenses of an algorithm is that in the brain there's no sharp distinction between the mindware, like what we think, what our brain or our mind does, and the wetware, the physiology of our brain. There's no sharp dividing line. It's kind of vertically integrated all the way from brain regions down to an individual cell. In a computer, there's this sharp division between software and hardware, which is by design what makes computers useful. Real brains aren't like that. And so there's a kind of through line, at least for me, about how we understand what the brain is doing at a larger scale that might determine whether I'm conscious or how my visual experience is going, and what it's doing at a much smaller scale of the business of actually staying alive, using metabolism to regenerate itself. There's a through line. At least I think there's a through line. So I feel that artificial consciousness, real artificial consciousness, if that's not an oxymoron, might require real artificial life.
So you mentioned in your book about beast machine theory, which is kind of what you're saying there, really, that a consciousness needs to basically look after itself, want itself to live and to survive. And so if we were to create an artificial intelligence which did have the desire or the will to survive, is that when things become dangerous? You mentioned in the book, for example, I can't remember the name of the philosopher is it Metzinger? Who asked for a 30-year freeze on consciousness research because programming an artificial intelligence with the desire to keep itself alive which is what you're saying there, which might be necessary for consciousness, suddenly becomes quite a dangerous prospect.
Well, not really any of those things.
Good.
So Metzinger, firstly, fortunately, he didn't call for a freeze on consciousness research. He called for a moratorium on research into developing machine consciousness. Now, I honestly kind of agree with him, though I think that no one should really be actively trying to create a conscious AI. It's like, why would you do that apart from the desire to play God? It's a bit of a strange goal to have. It's ethically very, very dubious indeed. Fortunately, I think it's very unlikely to happen. There are many other theories that do suggest that consciousness is just a matter of computation. And if they are right, and they may be right, then it's much more likely than I think it is, which would, I think, be a bad thing. But if I'm on the right track, who knows, that life, something to do with life is important, that is not the same as just programming a robot with a sort of motivation to charge its batteries every now and again. Because described that way, you're still kind of importing all the assumptions and the legacy of this computational view that it's programmed to do something. We're not programmed to do that. We're not programmed to have metabolism. We have metabolism. We often talk too loosely about this with our genes as well. Our genes are programmed, or they program us to do this or that. No, they're just part of the deeply complex integrated physiological system that we are. So I don't think it would be enough to have, let's say, a fancy humanoid robot that you then program its digital brain to go and make sure it plugs itself in or repairs itself if it gets damaged. My suspicion is that the difference between conscious systems and non-conscious systems goes deeper. It goes down to the level of the fact that we're made of cells that regenerate their own components, that transfer energy into matter and back again. I think that's critical. Of course, I have to say, I don't know that that's the case, but I think it gives a good explanatory grip on why consciousness is the way it is. I think more worrying for me than AI in this sense is people are now building these so-called brain organoids. These are collections of brain cells in dishes in the lab that, again, for very good reasons, for medical research and so on. And they don't do anything particularly interesting. So people aren't yet very worried about the fact they might be conscious, at least not in the public domain. But they're made out of the same stuff. So a whole kind of area of uncertainty goes away. I mean, who knows whether I'm on the right track, that being alive matters in some way. But once you start creating living systems, then I might be right, I might be wrong. It doesn't matter because that's already being done. You've already put that condition in. And as these systems get more complex, then they may start to have the capacity to experience in a way that we may never even be tempted to notice because they're not going to do anything.
One more question before we pass to the audience for questions. And as you were talking there, I was thinking about, might be slightly outside of your area of research, but there's a lot of research at the moment about how consciousness might be distributed across different parts of our body, particularly our gut microbe. And I was wondering whether we can look for clues outside of the brain if we're talking about it as a kind of embodied experience.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. I mean, I think another unfortunate habit of neuroscientists, perhaps unsurprisingly given the name, is to sort of focus on the brain to the neglect of the rest of the body. I think this has been a problem because brains didn't evolve without the context of the body. And the body is in continual dialogue with the brain. And indeed, neurons aren't just in the brain. We have a bunch of neurons in our gut. We've got some around our heart. There's probably, neurons elsewhere too. The neurons in our gut generate the most serotonin, this chemical that's often influencing brain function. A lot of that's coming from the gut. The neurons in the gut also generate brain rhythms. They oscillate together and they can be synchronized with rhythms in the main brain. So I have no doubt, well, I think it's very, very likely, and there's good evidence. I should never say I have no doubt. Always got some amount of doubt. I think there's very good evidence and reason to believe that what brains do is very, very intimately related to what's going on in the body, and that involves neurons outside of the brain as well. It's a very different question to say, is your gut conscious? I think your gut can affect consciousness. Is it itself conscious? I don't know. I think it's unlikely. The reason I think it's unlikely is that there's no good reason for it to have to be conscious. Like, consciousness for us seems to be associated with guiding behavior and integrating lots of different information in ways which the gut by itself doesn't have to do. And even large parts of your brain, my brain, aren't particularly involved in consciousness. It's not something that is generally useful for everything that's biological. So I don't think your gut is conscious.
Great. Questions from the audience, really. I think there is a roaming mic. If anyone upstairs wants to speak, I'll just say it louder for you because there's no mic up there. So if you guys want to speak, please do. Yes.
You said earlier, and I agree with this, that there's no sharp boundary between the mind's hardware and the brain's hardware and the mind's software. And so, as you say, you need a whole body with a brain in it. Do you think that if computers were big enough to be able to simulate all of that, do you think that it might then be possible to have artificial intelligence?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. What if we had enough computational oomph to simulate all the intricate detail? Yeah. Right down to whatever level. This is a beautiful question. People talk about this in terms of whole brain emulation, and people actually, I think, some people have the hope that if they do this and they emulate their own whole brain, they can somehow upload themselves into it and live forever. In some sort of weird silicon rapture. The first question is whether there would be anything it would be like to be a whole brain emulation, is another way of phrasing your question, right? I don't think so. And I think the key reason why is you hint at a very important distinction, which is that simulation of something is, in general, not the same as a recreation of that thing. I mean, one of the reasons computers are so useful is they can simulate basically anything. That's one of their wonderful properties. In most cases, we're completely unconfused about the fact that the simulation is not recreating the thing being simulated. If we simulate a weather system, we do not expect it to actually get windy or start raining inside the computer, right? And it's just not, nobody, I mean, some people say, well, maybe for a simulated person within it, it would be wet, but that's building in the assumption that a simulation of brain is enough.
But you always drop detail when you do.
Well, I mean, but let's the luxury of a thought experiment. Let's just assume that you don't drop any detail. That's why you need a computer the size of the universe or something like that. But even if you do that, even if you had a computer the size of the universe simulating a rainstorm, it's still not wet. It's just a very, 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 very detailed simulation. The only times where simulation of something actually generates the thing is if the thing is itself a computation. Like if I simulate an algorithm, like something that maps some numbers to another number, then I'm recreating that algorithm because its nature is computation. So basically it's a gamble. Like, whole brain emulation would be enough if computation is sufficient for consciousness. Then you're okay. But the weird thing is, like, if computation is sufficient for consciousness, then the whole motivation to do this kind of whole brain emulation is really undermined, because the point of doing it is this sort of idea that, well, the detail matters. And if the detail matters, then it's very unlikely that computation will be enough, because computation is motivated by the idea that the detail doesn't matter.
I've always had a problem that there's something that it's like to be me, because a lot of the most significant conscious activity that I engage in is almost necessarily involves a loss of a sense of self. I mean, if you think of sport, like I used to do a lot of sport, at the moment you're in an important match doing stuff, you're engaged in conscious, intelligent activity, but there isn't really anything that it's like to be, you're just doing it. When you're writing, you could either have a kind of pre-reflective rehearsal of what you're going to write, or just write or speak. You externalize thought, but you haven't had a pre-rehearsal necessarily internally. That's the thought that you then express. Like I'm kind of slightly choked up on my voice. I'm now trying to speak and I'm conscious of my voice, but I'm not conscious of what I'm going to say next. It just comes from nowhere and it's conscious activity. And at the best questions I've ever asked as an interviewer or somebody in the audience.
Like this one.
Well, it may be a terrible one, but it's just coming out. It's not like there's something that it's like to be me all the time. I only get there's something like that it's like to be me when I stop and then reflect. And that's a kind of confabulation at that point.
So I don't think I explained myself or Thomas Nagel properly then. It's not about self-reflective awareness. The idea of consciousness being there is something it is like to be you doesn't mean that you are thinking, oh, it's like this to be me. I am playing sport or I am thinking about what to say. When you are playing sport or thinking about or talking or whatever you're doing, there is some experience going on. You do not have to, I think that's part of the force of this definition, that it doesn't assume an ego, it doesn't assume a self, it just assumes that there is some kind of conscious experience happening. A lot of discussion these days about minimal phenomenal experience for a human being. What is the simplest experience it's possible for a human being to have? And one of the interesting angles on this is states where there's complete dissolution of the ego. This might be in very, very deep states of meditation. It might be in after some kinds of psychedelics. It might be in some other situations as well. But there seem to be some states where the ego is not just like partially gone, as it might be when you're playing sport or playing an instrument, let's say, but wholly gone. There is no experience of self whatsoever. The point is that consciousness is still happening. You have no reflexivity on it, but it's still happening. Many non-human animals may have this kind of thing. They may have conscious experiences, but without a sense of self there. The whole point is that all that you're asking in this definition is that experiencing is going on, not that there has to be the experience of being the subject of experience. That's something extra.
Can I just come back very, very quickly? Doesn't that imply there's an experiencer? How can you have an experience without an experiencer?
There has to be some locus to the experience, but you're confusing two different things here. You're confusing the fact there has to be something where the experience is happening. There's an experiencing going on, but there doesn't have to be a conscious experiencer for a conscious experience. There just has to be conscious experience. I could lose my sense of ego completely and still be conscious. If these brain organoids get to a sufficient level of complexity, they may have a conscious experience without being at all aware that they are having it, because there is no ego in an organoid. It's odd because we humans, we walk around with our egos all the time. A newborn baby might be a little bit like this. And also ego comes in, it doesn't have to be the full reflective, like, I'm thinking this. The fact that we have a first-person perspective and distinguish ourselves from the other, that's all part of the ego. All of this can go away. And consciousness is still possible, certainly conceptually.
Does it make sense to talk about consciousness without the ego?
Yeah.
Because in your book, for example, you distinguish between intelligence and consciousness, and you said the two are different.
Yeah.
So does it make sense to talk about consciousness without the ego, or will that not just be intelligence?
No, you can't subtract an apple from a pear and get a meringue. No. I think they're very different things. So the confusion of intelligence and consciousness is, again, one reason I think people falsely think that AI is about to become conscious, because we think we're intelligent and we know we're conscious, so we put them together. AI is, I think, a pretty good example of how you can get some forms of intelligence without having to attribute consciousness at all. The experience of the presence of an ego is, I think, part of conscious experience, which is so familiar to most of us for so much of the time that it's very hard to imagine consciousness without ego. But I think it's entirely possible. It may not happen very often, but I think it does happen. I think it can happen. And I certainly don't think there's any conceptual problem with thinking about something being conscious without there being an ego. Whether it happens in practice is a different question. Even then, I think the answer is yes, that it does.
Great. There's question at the back before I was to miss. Yep. Yeah. Leather jacket. Yeah.
Why are you skeptical about like asserting the dependency of life to the consciousness? Because like I work with computers, and even if we reduce the brain down to like how computers work, like in an algorithmic mechanism, then like human body, there's a constant influx of data all the time, like the replication of it with machines. Like, for example, nowadays in AI studies, AI research, there's machine vision, machine speech, but there's no proprioception. How is that to be replicated? And how can we design a system that is so lifelike, that is going to have the constant influx of like data, and that is going to be the AGI? Like, why are you a skeptic on that and not so assertive on life creates the consciousness?
Well, I mean, I think life is so. I don't mean to be skeptical of the life being necessary for consciousness. That's the view I'm kind of behind in a way, but I just don't want to be. I don't want to misrepresent it as being like something we can be 100% sure of. I think it's a very strong hypothesis that this intimate connection between life and consciousness. Now, when it comes to these other developments in AI, yes, we have machine vision. It's quite good. It's different from human vision. There's no sense in which machine vision has to be conscious.
Exactly.
Vision. It's just good at recognizing images and doing visually guided behavior. We can build in other senses too. Now that robotics is beginning to catch up to AI, we'll be able to build systems where there are things like proprioception, which by the way is the sense that we all have of body position. We just know where our body is in space. That's proprioception and how it's moving. Of course, you can give a robot that sense too. You can even give it the sense of its own interior, what in human beings we call, and animals we call interoception, the sense of the body from within. I think the point is you can do all of this.
But do we know what all is? Because we don't have a blueprint of brain. So what is the fear of machines becoming human-like in the near future? Like, I mean, I agree with you totally.
Two different questions. I mean, one is like, what will it... Maybe there are other ways of building things that are sufficiently human-like that most people don't care, right? That's entirely possible. Already, a lot of people deal with language models, and they're in the sense that they feel they're dealing with something sufficiently human-like already. People have relationships with chatbots and things like that. So the fact that we can't replicate perfectly a human being, in a sense, doesn't matter from our perspective, because in many cases we don't even care. But it does matter if we want to know what the system can do, and whether, for instance, it has ethically important properties like being conscious. Then it really, really does matter. Not how much we're taken in by it, but what's actually going on with it. So that's why I think these things are important. And just plugging on extra senses to a robot, I don't think does the trick. I think it may make it look more persuasive, but I don't think it does the trick.
Should we try and come to someone else? Because there's loads of hands in the air and I'm conscious of time. Yeah, you had your hand up in the air. Got early. Yeah.
Forgive me if this is too much like the previous gentleman's one. But do you think if consciousness is so clinical from like a physicalist perspective, do you think that undermines free will in some sense? Like in the sense that Strawson gets at, that we're all going towards a certain point if you can map the human brain in such a way?
There's always got to be a question about free will, hasn't there? It's always. It's did nobody get the no free will instructions on the way in? No. Okay. It's a great question, and I have to say, like when I was I love thinking and talking about free will. When I was writing the book, I thought like, I can't write a book on consciousness without a chapter on free will. But it was the one I struggled with by far the most, because it just combines so many confusing things together. There's, the confusion of, is the universe deterministic or not? Is there some fundamental randomness? There's the confusion of whether whether our conscious experiences of causing things to happen actually cause things to happen. And there's all that ethical and moral confusions about, well, if there's no free will, then how is anybody responsible for their actions? And you put all these things together, and it's no wonder that people get into a horrible mess about it. But I think there's a way to think about free will which makes sense, which means that we have the degree of free will that we need, not necessarily the degree of free will that you might aspire to. There's a sense of free will in which consciousness sort of swoops into the brain and causes things to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. Takes advantage maybe of some intrinsic randomness in the universe, loads the dice. I don't think we have that kind of free will. I don't think we need or want that kind of free will. That's a spooky kind of free will. Doesn't explain anything. We human beings, we're very complex systems. When we do something, there's a lot of causes which stretch back in time. Some of them come more from within the body than outside the body. If somebody hits you, you might respond very quickly and it won't feel voluntary. But if you decide to get up and go and have a drink after this, it feels voluntary. The causes are still all physical causes, but when you do something voluntary, the causes remain a little bit within your body a bit more. I think what we experience as free will is the brain's perception of the causes of the actions that it makes. And when the brain infers that the causes of an action come more from the inside, they have this sort of freedom from immediacy, to use the words of Mike Shadlin, a neuroscientist. When the brain infers that our actions have this freedom from immediacy, we experience them as freely willed. Is this useful? Do we really have free will? Well, yes. Our organism, it means that the actions we do are more constrained by what we are. And I think that's the kind of free will that we want. It's like a freedom from being forced to do anything else, as much as it's a freedom to do what we want. Because what do we want? Well, that depends on what we are. So if we do what we are, we have the free will. We have all the free will that we need, and we experience it. It has a utility too, because maybe the next time we might do something different. I think the experience of free will marks out those actions that come largely from within, so that as an organism, we might learn from them in a particular way and do something different the next time. So that is all the free will I think that any of us actually need to retain our dignity as human beings, which is fine, if you want to.
So do you think the causal processes like in the brain, they don't undermine free will?
No, I don't. I think so. Philosophers sometimes talk about this as compatibilism, that there's a version of free will which is compatible with the universe being deterministic, and causal processes in the brain and the body underlying everything. If you give that up, then what you're looking for is either randomness, which I don't think is the kind of free will that we want, just like behaving randomly, or something that's a bit spooky, parachuting in and loading the dice in a more strategic way. So I think free will has to be compatible with the brain being this complex nexus and network of causes. And I think that's fine.
Alex,
We've got time for two more questions.
at the front, Alex O'Connor, the cosmic skeptic at the front.
Oh, nice to hear that. Thank you. Most people think that consciousness requires complexity. But hearing you say two things, the first about how we often project ideas of consciousness based on our human experience of consciousness onto other animals. That might not be what it's like for a bat. But also, the way that we were just talking about consciousness without the ego. It seems like a really weird thing to imagine, but people who've done a lot of psychedelics, for example, have experienced that. They can't quite put it into words. So I can imagine someone or something which is conscious but has no ego. I can also imagine something which is conscious but can't see, but is still conscious. Can't hear, but is still conscious. I can imagine an organism that has no such thing as memory, like whatsoever, but is still conscious. And it seems that when I start taking those things away, and I try to think about what I'm actually left with, consciousness itself, not some of the things consciousness does in the human organism, like memory, self-perception, persistence through time, but just that, what it's like to be a thing, it feels like I'm left with something that's not complex at all, but like quite rudimentary and simplistic. And of course, that opened the door for its position as a fundamental aspect of the universe, because it doesn't seem so insane anymore to say that that's something akin to mass or charge. It's incredibly simple. But even outside of that, do you think that consciousness, not human consciousness or some of those things that it does, but consciousness itself requires complexity necessarily?
Thanks, Alex. That's very. I like this a lot, and I can kind of go on a bus with you up to a particular stop, but then I get off at a particular stop too. We'll see where that is. I think it's a really important observation that phenomenologically, which is to say, the experience of consciousness, the experience of being conscious, let's say, doesn't have to be particularly complex. Psychedelics can strip away the ego for human beings. There's a beautiful thought experiment, Greek thought experiment, Avicenna's Man, which imagines a man floating in the sky, and progressively every sensory modality is stripped away. And I think in the original, it only talks about the classical ones, the sight, sound, smell, whatever. But of course, we have all the internal ones. You can play the same game, and you say things. Well, there's no sight, and always the question is there still something it is like to be that system as you strip away all these things? And what are you left with if there is? The sort of pure essence of consciousness. I think this is conceptually possible for sure. It may happen. And we can certainly approximate. Does that mean complexity is necessary for consciousness? Well, here, I think the fact that the experience might be maximally simple doesn't mean that what's underlying it can also be that simple, right? It still might have to have some level of complexity under the hood, if you like, to support even the simplest conscious experience. And now is where I get off the bus, because the fact that experience can be maximally simple, I don't think really opens a door to panpsychism any more than having an out-of-body experience opens a door to the idea that your soul can leave your head and go and sit on the balcony. I think it's a mistake to draw conclusions from the content or lack of content of an experience to changing your beliefs about what metaphysical position might be right. I think you have to justify it in other ways.
Thank you, everybody. That's, I think, all we've got time for. Give a round of applause, Anil. I think.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you.
Want to support the channel? Join the Big Think members community where you get access to videos early, ad-free.